everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of the Economist Intelligence Unit's Global Outlook video. My name is Agathe Demarais, and I'm the Global Forecasting Director at the Economist Intelligence Unit. I'm joined today by Andrew Viteritti, who's our Managing Editor for Commerce and Regulation, and Keren Uziyel, who's a Senior Analyst in our Middle East and Africa team. Today, we're going to discuss the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on globalization and have an outlook for the Middle East region in 2021. Before we start, one word about our latest forecasts. We believe that global output is going to contract by 5.2% this year, which is quite a grim outlook. And we believe that next year, the recovery is going to be very slow. In fact, we believe that global output is not going to recover to pre-coronavirus levels before 2022. 2020 and 2021 are essentially lost years for growth. Beyond these revisions, actually, what we've seen, and we've just published a white paper on this topic written by Andrew, it's that the pandemic is having a big impact, and it's producing major shifts behind the scenes on globalization and supply chains. So Andrew, I'm going to turn to you now, maybe starting by getting a better sense of how the pandemic has impacted international commerce. So first, can you tell us a bit more about the effect of the pandemic on future prospects for foreign direct investment?
Sure, Agathe. Well, the effect has been quite severe. So back in June, the 10 countries that were reporting the most coronavirus cases worldwide included the US, which of course still tops the list, as well as a few of its G7 peers and the likes of Spain, Brazil, and India. These countries accounted for well over a third of global FDI inward stock and inflows in 2019, a share that bumps out to 60% when we include China, Hong Kong, and Singapore, three economies that, of course, have fallen well within the crosshairs of the current crisis. Now, since then, the list of 10 economies reporting the most cases has shifted a bit, with economies in Latin America and Africa being added, and that's indicated an increasingly more widespread and really more thoroughly global hit to important country FDI channels. Now, there also has been a number of disruptions to industry channels for FDI. We only have to think of industries like hospitality, tourism, retail, entertainment, and energy, to name a few. And all told, these impacted industries accounted for as much as 40% of total cross-border merger and acquisition and greenfield FDI projects in 2019. Now, overall, the UN is projecting that the pandemic will reduce global FDI flows by about 40% in 2020 to 2021, which is a deeper contraction than the 35% drop that we had seen during the global financial crisis in 2008 to 9. That outcome is not terribly surprising, given everything I just said about the strain that's put on traditional FDI channels. It's even less surprising when we consider that many countries worldwide, particularly larger economies, have tightened their FDI regulations amid the pandemic. So overall, again, we're looking at quite the grim picture for FDI.
Okay, well, that's a fairly bleak outlook. Andrew, what about for international trade? Any glimmer of hope or optimism? Anything positive?
Well, unfortunately, there we have a grim picture as well, Agathe. So international trade had already been slowing in 2018, and that reflected a rise in protectionist policy, as well as the US-China trade war. What the pandemic has essentially done is it's tipped the scales further with the lockdowns that we had seen constricting factory output, breaking transport links, and sinking demand. The pandemic also exposed the vulnerabilities of concentrating supply chains in a single location. We just need to think of China as an example. Now, overall, the EIU is forecasting that global trade volumes will fall by about 16% on average this year, and that will eclipse the 12% drop that we saw in 2009 during the global financial crisis.
Okay, so a bleak outlook here too. So to sum up, we have quite a big outlook for FDI. We have quite a big outlook for trade. Does that suggest that the pandemic is the death knell of globalization, Andrew?
Well, the pandemic certainly has created a very difficult environment for globalization. That's definitely clear. But a closer inspection suggests that it may be too early to count globalization out entirely. A big part of this has to do with how multinational companies are likely to respond to the pandemic. Essentially, as executives shift their focus from short-term damage control to longer-term resilience, they're unlikely to view withdrawing from international commerce as desirable, profitable, or really even feasible. And for that reason, the changes that would be required to end globalization don't seem to be forthcoming. So let's take reshoring, which has been tossed around as a possible way of limiting supply chain exposure and certainly would be very effective in ending globalization if it was done en masse. This is a highly expensive and time-consuming option for multinationals. It also would drive production costs up and make it very difficult for firms to sell competitively at home or overseas. Now, there's also stockpiling, and sure, we might see some of that in the future, but it's hardly intuitive as to how companies can put that at the core of their operations in a sustainable, cost-effective, or really game-changing type of way. And then there's regionalization, which still, of course, has a cross-border dimension, but necessarily would eat away at the global nature of globalization. But this too has limited potential due mainly to politics. And we only have to think of still tense relations between the US and Mexico, or Brexit dominating the European trade agenda for the foreseeable future as examples of how the political scope really isn't there to build new, robust regional trading systems in a meaningful way. So now, what does all this mean? Well, for firms, at least in the near term, it seems like the pandemic is not going to lead to radical changes. Instead, we're more likely to see very precise and carefully selected adjustments to the status quo from things like increased redundancy or a China plus one supply chains model. But ultimately, that pervasive nature of cross-border global economic activity, it's not going to die, and neither will globalization.
Thanks so much, Andrew. But that's still a bleak outlook. That's really interesting. So regionalization, more redundancy. I think that's really interesting, and I'm sure that our clients will be very interested to hear that. I'm going to turn to Keren now, hopefully with some more positive news about the outlook for the Middle East in 2021. And actually, to start with some positive news, I'm going to ask you a question, Keren, that is positive by essence. Which countries do we think in our forecasts at the EIU will rebound the quickest, the fastest from the current shock?
Well, Agathe, the picture in the Middle East and North Africa is also rather gloomy overall. The economies of the region are going to shrink by about 6% this year, and the bounce back will be one of the weakest of the regions globally. That doesn't mean to say that there aren't some countries that are resilient enough and have the resources to weather the storm. The ones we're looking at most optimistically are the GCC economies, particularly Qatar, UAE, and Saudi Arabia, the ones with the deepest pockets fiscally, that are going to sustain their economies and build out the environment for their private sectors over this period and continue with welfare support and fiscal stimulus to see the economies through the pandemic. Other countries that will do relatively well are small export-oriented economies with relatively strong institutions like Israel, despite their poor management of a second wave of the pandemic. The economy should be fairly resilient. It's had many years of strong growth over the past couple of decades, very sound external finances, and an export mix that's relatively resilient. Another country that will do relatively well is Egypt, again, because it's institutionalized a set of reforms. It has close connections regionally with the powerhouses in the Gulf, and also with multilateral agencies such as the IMF, the World Bank, and European banks. And that should put it on a relatively stable path economically. However, we still have a lot of conflict zones in the region, and coronavirus is just piling on more problems for these economies. So the conflict zones in countries such as Iran or Algeria, which are politically or diplomatically or economically isolated, are going to be the ones that will suffer the most through the pandemic. Their problems predate COVID, but the pandemic has deepened their problems, and they don't have the deep pockets of the Gulf states to see them through the storm in the same way. So a gloomy picture, I'm afraid, Agathe, but with a few highlights.
No, but what I find very interesting in what you say, Keren, and it's the same with you, Andrew, it's that the problems predated the pandemic. And it's the same with what you mentioned, Andrew, it's that the shifts that we are forecasting were actually already ongoing. And it's something that we've been saying for a while at the EAU. The pandemic is not going to change things, but it's going to accelerate ongoing trends, for instance, the fragmentation of the geopolitical order. Okay, second question for you, Keren. Note that we've talked about the countries. Let's talk about the sector. Which sectors do you think will record growth? And do you believe that Middle East countries are well placed to take advantage of this growth?
I'm afraid, again, that most of the economies in the Middle East are not among the best placed globally to take advantage of the key sectors that are going to perform well in technology and healthcare and pharmaceuticals, for instance, that we see as leading the way. So within the Middle East and North Africa region, there'll be few winners in terms of sectors and many losers. The principal losers will be tourism, which is particularly important in parts of North Africa, but also certain parts of the Gulf and the Eastern Mediterranean. And also the oil sector, the energy sector, where the global supply glut and low prices going into 2021 will mean that the recovery and investment in the dominant oil and gas sector will be rather slow. There are some exceptions. ADNOC in the UAE, notable one, it's been spending right through on longer term capacity projects. But overall, for the oil and gas sector, again, a very gloomy picture. There are some pockets of hope. So the public sector infrastructure projects will continue. This will particularly be the case again in the GCC economies, but also countries such as Morocco and Egypt, which will use infrastructure spending, not just in terms of improving the landscape for the private sector, but as a way of propping up aggregate demand, and very importantly in those economies for employment purposes. So that's a definite positive. Lebanon has good prospects for infrastructure build out and reconstruction, but that's in the much longer term. So we're looking beyond 2021. But the Gulf economies will be spending in areas such as electricity, water and telecoms, laying the groundwork for a stronger operating infrastructure and business environment in the longer term. Healthcare will be an important area of investment, particularly again in the Gulf, but also the middle income countries such as Jordan and Egypt are also looking into reforming the way their healthcare systems work and using technology in a more widespread way. So that's definitely an area of development and possibly innovation in some countries. In terms of technology, Israel will continue to be the market leader in terms of exporting these kind of technologies. It has key strengths in some areas of pharmaceuticals and biotechnology, but also in artificial intelligence and cybersecurity, which are all going to continue to be important globally. And high technology services will be the real engine of growth in Israel, as it has been historically. And they've proved quite resilient so far during the pandemic. Elsewhere in the region, we could see the development of internet-based businesses and education services. And these are things that could develop in terms of employment and innovation in some of the middle income economies of the Middle East and North Africa, places like Egypt and Jordan again. And e-commerce finally will be a key area of growth. E-commerce is well established in the wealthier economies in the Gulf and in Israel again. But it has really grown quite strongly over the past few months due to pandemic restrictions. And I think we'll see it gain a stronger foothold in several countries such as Egypt, Morocco, and Jordan, where the internet infrastructure has improved over the last few years. It will be somewhat restricted even in those countries though by high income inequalities, and elsewhere in the region, poverty and poor technology infrastructure is going to be a severe limitation on its development. But as you can see, there are a few glimmers of hope, but these aren't areas that the region has a particularly strong grounding in, and hence the relative weakness of the recovery next year.
Okay, so a bleak outlook here too. So one final question for you, Keren. I think that we've seen quite a massive exodus of migrant workers from GCC countries this year, obviously, because of the pandemic, the recession. Do we believe that this exodus is going to be reversed in 2021?
That's right, Agathe. Hundreds of thousands of foreigners have returned home, principally, but not exclusively, from the GCC states, where they form the majority populations in those countries. The bulk of those are returning to South Asia, India and Pakistan and so on. But there are also many expatriate workers of Arab origin who work in the Gulf. Their return in the next year or two will be very unevenly distributed, reflecting the weakness of the economic recovery in the region, but also policy constraints. We will see construction workers, mostly South Asian, returning to the Gulf to work on those infrastructure projects that I mentioned, where we wouldn't expect under any circumstance local, national citizens to be willing to take part in very hard manual labour, and there will be quite a lot of opportunities in these government-funded projects, less in residential construction and so on, but we will see a substantial return of those kind of workers. Less so in the services sector. I think we will see some GCC states using the massive expatriate exodus as a way to leverage long-held plans for nationalising the private sector workforce. Gulf citizens tend to prefer working in the public sector, where pay and other benefits are much more generous, and have tended to avoid working in the private sector. In some Gulf economies, private sector employment is something like 95% expatriate. And so we will see these countries try and roll out wider nationalisation policies in employment, but they will be very wary of A, political resistance of cutting back public sector jobs, and B, also any damage to their business environment and the perception of foreign companies operating there as to the nature of their workforce. So there will be limitations on that. I think the services sector will be the main push for nationalisation of the workforce, and that will probably damage foreign labour from within the Arab world more than expatriates from further afield. So this will affect expatriate workers, particularly Lebanon, Jordan and Egypt. And that'll have a serious knock-on impact on their labour markets and on social stability there. So it's going to be a challenging time politically across the region, with these countries struggling under the weight of high unemployment and the lack of economic opportunities that preceded the pandemic, and with the further pressure from the fallout from the coronavirus and what it has done to regional labour markets.
Thanks so much, Keren, and thanks so much, Andrew. We're coming to the end of our video now. You can always find our latest analysis on our website, www.eau.com. Keep an eye on our latest research. We've just published white papers on US-China relations under Biden administration, on the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on supply chains, and actually the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on supply chains in the Middle East specifically. And these are really interesting white papers that I would really encourage you to take a look at. You can also find our latest research on Twitter at the EIU, or on our personal Twitter feeds, and hopefully our handles should show nicely on the screen. I look forward to recording the next Global Outlook video of the Economist Intelligence Unit next month. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching. Stay safe. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.